Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today on the Education 40 Under 40 event. I'm really glad to be starting off the panel discussions for the day. And our topic could not be more suited for this. We're talking about transformation. And transformation and reformation is always a sign of development in a country. So as our industry changes, as our markets evolve, as the demands change in a country, the education system has to be on the forefront of that. And with that, I would like to just get into our discussion, because I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. And I'd like to start with Ms. Anand, who's sitting right next to me. Can you please tell me, if transformation is an indication of development, what are the indications in our education system that kind of show this?
See, transformation, I think, is relative, but it's important for the education system in our country to move ahead with how, say, this job sphere and how employment is changing, how the kind of jobs are changing, the kind of skill sets required are changing, right? Students are expected to have certain skill sets before they enter the workforce now. So it's not only important for them to get a holistic academic learning, but also have certain skills that are required, at various jobs. So it's more about moving towards and transforming our education system towards a more holistic, all-rounded learning experience, rather than focusing just on theoretical concepts or on marks or on scoring high grades. Yes, all of that is very important to get into right colleges and to pursue the career that you want, but it's also important to have that practical knowledge. While theoretical knowledge is very important, it's also important to be able to use those theories in practice. And I think that is something that we're going to hopefully see with the new education policy and the changes that are coming forward in the education system. So let's see what really ends up happening when everything comes to the implementation part of it. But it does seem to be moving in the right direction. We do seem to have adopted a lot of educational practices from across the globe. There are a lot of educational boards coming up, a lot of international schools across the country. Various states, states like Jharkhand, Bihar, all of those states have hundreds of new international schools coming up, so access to education is something that has really come to the forefront recently. And I think the ability for students from all across the country to be able to access this education is going to transform our country and the education system.
No, thank you. I mean, access to education and access to different forms of education is what we're seeing a lot more of in today's age. Mr. Gupta, I would like to come to you. What kind of transformation are we seeing, and how is it impacting your work in particular?
Hello. Right, so see, from transformation perspective, if you see, the overall focus should not just be on one single segment, that is skill development, but overall competency development. We should not just see transformation as a way wherein we win elections through jobs. Yes, skills definitely impacts jobs, but overall, whether the jobs are moving in the right direction or not, are we catering to just the demand, or is it also the requirement, right? The requirement of the industry is not. For instance, we were just talking to someone on .NET, right? .NET is a technology which is currently obsolete relatively, right? It is not the technology of the present and the future. So we need to focus on those skills, those technologies, which apparently will create jobs not just for the present times, but also for the times ahead, right? Because we have to look at the jobs, the careers ahead 10 years, 20 years down the line also. And that's where not just the job segment, but also the freelancing segment is very going well. The gig economy in India and South Asia is one of the biggest, and has huge potential, especially in today's time when retention of people is extremely very difficult, right? So gig economy is the times for present and the future. And yes, entrepreneurship, India is doing very well in that segment also. So skill building and competency development should not just be focusing on job segment, but also towards entrepreneurship and self-employment, that is freelancing. So that's where the overall segment is important. And that's where at Henry Harvin, when we were doing this research as to how should we focus on competency development and not just one single skills, we focused on the internship parts, the placements part, the overall boot camps, wherein we can develop the overall capability of an individual. And that's the way I feel would bring transformation out there in the industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as the market demands changes, and that has definitely changed, and over the pandemic, we did see that, the skilling part of it was not affected as much as, of course, formal education was, and also access to education, the way that was affected. Dr. Talwar, I would like to come to you now. We're talking about transformation, and of course, we have transformation happening on a macro scale, with the NEP 2020 coming into play, and also on a micro scale. And could you tell us about your take on this?
So I think we, as a higher education system or the Indian education system is operating on two fronts at the moment. One, obviously, there's the quantity front, right? So we, in the last many years, especially post 1980s, whatever, with the private sector coming into, let's say, higher education, there's been a lot of focus on being able to develop and build institutions. So, which I technically call as the hardware side, the infrastructural side. A lot of this has obviously happened. Now, the jury's still out about whether all this quantity infrastructure is being able to deliver what it's supposed to deliver in terms of certain learning outcomes, or in terms of certain outcomes that are, let's say, beyond learning outcomes, graduation outcomes, or whatever, in the short term or in the long term. Obviously, that means that now there's a lot of focus on the quality side as well. So there's a lot of focus on the regulatory systems to not only look at the input as a mechanism, or the input of certain resources, how much are you spending, what's the acreage or whatever else, but now it's a lot to do with what are the outcomes within the system. So I think we're obviously operating at two levels right now, the quantity level and the quality level. What we'll also have to look at, and this is what the new education policy tries to address, looking at this whole idea of the eligible gross enrollment ratio going up to 50%. So which means that even the decision makers are concerned about the fact that there are a lot of people out there who should be in education and not yet in education, right? So there's a lot of focus on that currently. Of course, I think it also depends on how, when we are implementing these policies, are we able to also learn a little bit from cases such as the UK or wherever, when they obviously opened up, they expanded, they maximized the number of institutions, they possibly converted a lot of their polytechnics into universities. So a lot of that experience needs to be brought in to understand whether we go in the right way forward. But I think from a macro perspective, obviously intake, dropout rates are very important, right? Promotion rates are very important. Diversity rates are very important. If you're trying to transform, right? If you're truly wanting to transform, a lot of these factors will be important. Closer home, being a management institution, obviously a lot of focus is now on, and I don't mind saying it, that most management institutions, irrespective of rank, till at least a few years back, were largely teaching-oriented institutions, right, which were essentially offering a certain basic, requirement, which was a placement, a job, which he was highlighting. But in the last few years, there's a lot of focus now on, what are we doing as far as the learning piece is concerned? What are we doing as far as research is concerned? What are we doing as far as social impact is concerned? This, I fundamentally believe, is transformation in its right way.
Right, absolutely, and diversity, inclusion, social impact have definitely come up at the forefront, especially after the pandemic, where we did see certain sections of society being affected more than other sections, and that's important, and that's why I also think the education system has sort of become a little bit more job-oriented, because you need to be a little bit practical about the situation of everyone involved, giving them the options for every aspect of education, whether that's even in skilling, you need to have those options available. Mr. Basani, finally coming to you, what is your take on transformation in Indian education system? And you've heard what your co-panelists have said. Do you have any comments to add to that?
Yeah, just to build on what they all just spoke about, at the macro level, we have the NEP 2020, which laid out kind of the roadmap for the next 15 years. And the key will be execution, and transformation is not going to happen overnight. And this aspect, I think, at the macro level, we need to figure out, okay, which direction are we going at? Is the goal of India to have maximum number of top 100 ranking institutions? Is the goal to increase that GER, graduate enrollment ratio, to 50%? So it comes down to priority. It comes down to what we really need to put on our plate. And I think more even at the micro level, which is more at the institutional level, can we all contribute at, more than just skilling? Because right now, skilling has become so synonymous to learning, because it gets confused that what are we really talking about? So this entire aspect is coming down to ensuring that a bit of experimentation is also considered along the journey. Of course, keeping the fundamentals, keeping the hygiene factors in mind. We as a nation are very different from the other countries. So copying them, probably learning from their best practices always helps. But we have to take that bit of experimentation mindset. I think India should look at ourselves as startups, most institutions, except for the top maybe 1 to 5%, most institutions should have that mindset of experimenting a little, because what works for us may not work for another institution, the same practice. I think with that in mind, that's the beauty of the nation, right? And we build various institutions which have different, best practices that we could learn from.
Absolutely. Focusing on every institution's unique pedagogy and also finding out their best practices and how it worked, who it worked for, can definitely have a larger impact on our whole education system. Thank you, Mr. Vasani. I would like to come back to Mr. Gupta now and start with you on my next question, actually, because, we are talking about transformation and we also have to talk about trends. We've seen over the past 2 years, many trends came up with online learning, and slowly we're seeing some of them die out. How do we kind of differentiate between something that's going to be a transformation, that's going to change our education system in a large way or in a long run at least, on what is just something that's fleeting?
Right. So, see, if you see the past 2-3 years were kind of very dramatic for the entire edtech industry, right? So, demonetization gave a boost to the fintech, and the last 2 years pandemic gave a boost to the edtech. So, few things stayed, right? You see the upskilling, reskilling space with online education. It is continuing. I'll talk about the time in 2013-14 when we started in 2013. We were serving colleges initially, right? And at that point of time, having certification courses, diploma courses from an outside edtech company to a college was a trend. It could have been a trend if it would have died out, right? But it continued. Right now, we are working with more than 130 colleges pan-India. We are serving them as their skilling partners, or maybe delivering their electives, delivering their certification programs as a VAP, or their subjects. It continued for the past till now. It's 9 years and it's still continuing, right? It's no longer a trend now. It has become a transformation. However, when you see online education for kids, it has gone down tremendously, right? So that apparently is appearing as a trend, but yes, it will have its own transformation. The hybrid model will appear and it will go on. So trend is something which in education space, a lot of trends are coming, and yes, as you can see, hybrid model is going to take up the way forward. And along with hybrid, if you talk about few segments within the education space, it can go pure online. However, some cannot. It depends. For example, if you want to learn mechanical engineering related concepts, you cannot do it online, right? If you want to learn electrical engineering, you cannot. But if you talk about maybe programming skills, you can. You talk about language skills, you can. So it depends on what segments you're focusing on. So how we have been focusing on, we look out what kind of jobs are there in the market, then we update our curriculums and then put it forward. We look at what kind of freelancing opportunities are there. We look at what kind of entrepreneurship segments are available. And that's how we tend to focus on building a curriculum. It's a transformation. However, earlier we used to focus on what kind of a requirement is coming out from the industry, and we were basically basing on that, or maybe what the accreditation bodies are defining. Now we are not bringing our programs based on accreditation bodies, but based on what the industry requirement is, because that is what will bring transformation. And trend is something which can be there for a year or two, but cannot sustain for long.
Absolutely. So there needs to be some kind of focus on trends, but that can't be the only thing that you are offering. You need to still build a strong foundation. Dr. Talwar, if I may come to you, because you're working with a B school, you have so many students coming in and out, and it's so important for you to sort of make sure that everyone is ready for the immediate future, but as well as the long run. So how do you kind of balance between, trends and transformation?
So I think, obviously, in the last 2.5 years, a lot of traditional setups have had their hearts in their mouth, right? So what's going to happen? There's no doubt about that. But I think if I look at it detached and possibly dispassionately, you'll have to understand, possibly the capital structures of edtech organizations as opposed to traditional, colleges, higher education institutions. And a lot of focus, obviously, for edtech firms has been on scale. And in this case, scale in terms of customer acquisition, scale in terms of student acquisition. And it's heartening to see now that there's a lot of focus on being able to deliver on the quality side. So the nature of the hiring at the moment in edtech firms is around, let's say, graduation outcomes, is around, academic leadership coming in to be able to ensure that assurance of learning is taking place. So I think that's the nature of the edtech. Obviously, what you also have to remember is that a lot of transition into perceiving or getting perceived value out of a learning that is coming from a blended approach or from an online approach does require a lot of change, right? Does require a lot of change, not only from the faculty side, but also from the student side. We are largely operating in a zone where, as somebody did mention, marks is primarily the driver, right? Or CGPA is primarily the driver. And in such scenarios, when you're asking a student to be a little bit more focused on flipped approaches to learning or learning by yourself and then coming into the classroom, that student is a little concerned or a little finds it difficult. Okay, so that also means that even that student, along with higher educational setups, were waiting for these days when post-COVID, I'm calling this post-COVID with some trepidation, but they were obviously waiting for a post-COVID kind of scenario to happen, to have physical presence. Having said that, I think there's a lot that traditional setups like ours can learn from edtech firms. May not be in the core act of delivery in the classroom, because that is something we know that students do prefer, the touch and feel, and if you're trying to create leaders, automatically the whole peer orientation also becomes very, very important. But I think how we assess, how we evaluate, how we create constant engagement is something that we as educational institutions can learn from edtech firms. So I think there'll have to be some levels of constant engagement and learning between the both for both of us to possibly excel.
And I think we're already seeing that too, because there's so many collaborations happening, between industry, between edtechs and universities, between foreign institutes and Indian universities. There's a lot going on in the education sector. A lot of people working together to make sure that students get those kind of exposure and opportunities, and to make sure they're ready for really anything. Mr. Basani, I'd like to come to you now. Same thing, how do you kind of balance this? Trends versus transformation, preparing for a short term, preparing for the long term. How do you make sure students are getting that overall experience?
So one thing is, post-COVID, it was kind of an eye-opener for us as a brick-and-mortar institution, because we were not 100% prepared. And there's a lot to learn, like Sir just said, that edtech, there's a lot to learn from them. There are things, we have been quite watchful in the sense what's happening, is the whole scenario going to change and all of that. But going forward, it has been quite clear that that hybrid model, or getting that certain percentage of your learning into the online space, has its own benefits. And even at the central level, they are, now AICT is also promoting this and saying that, going forward, this is what institutions need to prepare themselves for. So transformation aspect of it, I think digital transformation is going to be, you can't get away with it, irrespective of the size of your institution, how old you are or how new you are. Everyone has to prepare themselves at their own capacities, not just to learning, but even administration. And when it comes to trends, I think more towards, I'll talk about it more towards a student perspective. Trends, because students have they have only one particular thing, and that's what's hot in the market. And they're usually, when they come to our campus, they say that I want to get into business analytics. But the questions that we ask is why? Like, why do you want to do it? Like, is it because the world is telling you? Is it because your friends are telling you to do this? And it comes back to the basics, and we tell them that, listen, this is great. The job market is going to hire for different positions, but you need to figure out what you're naturally inclined towards, what can you upscale towards, and not necessarily go with these highest packages and worry about which companies are coming in and all of that. And you'll be fine, because most often they are only thinking about that first job. They're not thinking about the long-term career. So that trends is, I think, sometimes even for us, it becomes more of a distraction. We need to just be aware of what's happening, but I think it shouldn't bother institutions, and institutions shouldn't really jump into the bandwagon of what's being offered newly. And for instance, I'll just give you a small example. In Bangalore, I'm not sure about in other places, BBA Aviation was one of the hot courses. It kind of is today, but people just many colleges started applying for BBA Aviation programs. Why? because they said, oh, there's a huge growth in this market. But then nobody's thinking long term. They're just thinking about that 1 season, 2 season, and then after that, everyone's forgetting and going and applying for new courses. So that alignment with institutions should change. I believe in one thing, that figure out things that come naturally to institutions and try to build upon it rather than dipping and coming out of different areas. Because eventually institutions are like people, and you want to build that personality, you want to build that clarity and vision of what you stand for. So.
No, thank you for bringing in the perspective of students. That is really important, because in the end of the day, they also create a demand, and there is a responsibility from institutions to kind of meet that demand, but to what extent can you do that? Where do you draw the line, and how do you explain it to them? Ms. Anand, I would like to come to you now. This conversation has also transformed. So I'd like to ask you, what lessons can we take from trends?
So I think what really differentiates, makes a trend very transformative is when you are trying to solve a need and a problem for students. What happened during the pandemic was, with the influx of edtech companies coming in, a lot of them were not creating products that actually students and parents wanted, or that they would want in a long term. Providing temporary solutions during COVID was one thing, but to not have a long-term strategy in terms of how you're going to solve that problem or need for years to come, even post-pandemic. Those are the companies I feel that sort of were trending at the moment, and will have to reconsider their offerings or USPs and stuff in a post-pandemic world. What was happening was, a lot of companies had come in, and they were sort of imposing their offerings, trying to take advantage of the online boost that had come in, without really understanding what does a student, a parent, or a teacher really want or require to maybe facilitate that learning, or to learn better, or to make the most of those 2 years. That physical learning wasn't possible. So I think that is something that we are going to see now. A lot of companies that had, capitalized on trends will have to move towards more permanent solutions that students, parents, and teachers really want, and that they will utilize, that is solving a problem for them. So that's the kind of reevaluation correction that you're seeing right now in the edtech system as well. And of course, like everyone has said, the future is going to be hybrid learning, just because during the pandemic, what happened was students and parents and teachers were forced to accept the online education, right? Pre-pandemic, no one really studied online. Higher education was something that people pursued online, but when it came to primary form of education, students and parents both. Parents didn't find online education serious, and students did not really have to ever delve deeper into it, so they didn't know the benefits, the pros or the cons of it. But what's going to happen is, post-pandemic, is the students and parents, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, but that's their consumer behavior, that they are sort of exhausted of studying online and want to go back to that physical form of learning. And that is what we are going to see now. The move back towards, offline, with, of course, online being there in a supplementary, complementary form of learning, because people have been forced to see the benefits of online education as well, whether it's time saving or convenience or various other factors. So it is going to be a blended form of learning, a hybrid form of learning in the future, and that is what I think each of us need to capitalize on, work towards, and build our models and visions to ensure that we are providing education the way students want education to be provided.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think you kind of pointed out a really important thing there, where online education is not really a trend, it was a necessity. And now we're trying to find how to kind of like obviously it's important for learning and it provides opportunities, but how do we kind of balance that with brick and mortar university, or even for primary education for that matter? How do we kind of balance the online learning with the going to schools and interactions? How do we get all those kind of holistic education together? On that note, I would like to come to Dr. Talwar again. Could you tell me a little bit, you were talking about competency a while back, and we were talking about trends and transformation. And right now there's a lot of focus on skilling. And obviously that's not the only aspect of education. We need to balance other aspects of it too. But how do we kind of go about that in the future? Like, how do we also measure competency? Like, you talked about getting some ideas from edtechs, but what from edtech have we particularly taken into account when looking at competency?
So I think where's the fulcrum? My bigger question is that, when we talk about, even at business schools, um, faculty who possibly focus a little bit more on the theoretical side, building of the theoretical side, at times may come across as people who are not practicing or, talking about the storytelling, the cases, and bringing in that practical perspective. But I think, as we were speaking earlier offline, I think both are important. The concept and the context are important. We keep talking about the skill, and we keep talking about the fact that can we apply it somewhere, but what do we apply? What's the fulcrum around it? So fundamentally speaking, if you're not focusing on both sides, what do we practice on? How do we expand? Are we then becoming one-trick ponies, right? Or are we then, not necessarily being able to go beyond a particular comfort zone? Right? So the fact that a certain kind of learning helps you expand your horizons is, very, very important. But you cannot deny the fact that, many a times, and this is where higher education institutions tend to find themselves limited, is the fact that they themselves don't necessarily focus on constant building of industry exposure for their faculty. Right? So that is fundamentally very important also. If you don't we allow a lot of sabbaticals, let's say, in academic institutions, going abroad or going to another institution in India. But how about also ensuring that there's a certain level of exposure within the industry? Go there for 6 months, come back in, bring in a lot of all that knowledge into the classroom, and that's when magic starts happening. I think this is where, at times, just to focus on theory or just to focus on practice will possibly not work well for both, right? It has to be married rather well. I think it also brings in this, your question of yours, also brings in this whole idea of the possible distrust between industry and academia as a whole, right? So wherein the industry believes that there's no point going to academia and working with them, or the academia believes these guys are not interested, they're only interested in the output of the students. But the fact is, I think it's important that we work on a triple helix kind of model, like in the US, wherein the government, the industry and the universities really work together to be able to ensure a certain levels of applicational prowess. Okay, and I think these are things that we'll have to obviously work on. Only that will then be able to enable a lot of the skill focus to actually be a little bit more relevant, at least in my opinion.
No, absolutely. And Ms. Anand, I can see you nodding your head. Would you like to add anything to Dr. Talwar's comments? Sure. Can you tell us a little bit about, again, we're talking about fixation on skilling right now. So how do we kind of balance other aspects of education with that?
I definitely think that, like you'd said, that it's about a holistic, all-rounded form of learning, right? You can't have you can't just be focused on academics and not be focused on extracurriculars and skill development, because you can be scoring a 99% in your exams, but if you don't have the correct skills to enter the workforce, then that 99% in your college or school is not really going to help you in any way. So it needs to be a combination. While the focus on academics is important to set the basics, the foundation, of an individual, of a student, and that is what's going to take them forward. It's also important to flank that in with the various skills that they require. So it's important to our students and, make them aware of the various skills that they can acquire, so that at an early age they can start to understand the different types of jobs available, the different types of employment opportunities available. So then they can start catering their skills and their academic learning, maybe their extracurricular learning, all towards one goal. Because today, even in the workforce, you don't, like I said, just having academic knowledge is not enough. You need to be a good, you need to work well in teams. You need to have certain skill sets depending on your jobs, right? You need to have various interpersonal skills. There are various skills that one requires in the workforce today that are not essentially taught in school, or weren't taught in school, at least when I was in school, right? Or when any of us were in school. But what we've seen today is, with the influx of global practices, with the influx of, like you said, having associations with other universities and colleges across the world, teachers from India and academia from India can then learn from, people across the world, and, they can learn from us, and we can together provide this holistic learning to our students, so that they not only succeed till college, and we have like the highest, like say 99% cutoff rates at various colleges and stuff, and we very proud of that, but we should also be proud of the kind of workforce we're putting into our bringing in every year into each industry. And for that, we need to have, like I said, a whole-rounded form of learning, and that can only happen if all institutes in the government, we all, and the edtech firms, we all work together towards this goal.
Thank you, Ms. Anand. Mr. Gupta, I'd like to come to you now. What are your thoughts and comments on what your co-panelists have sort of said right now? And also, speaking on competencies and all the things that Ms. Anand just spoke about, how do we kind of measure that? And can it be done online?
Right. So carrying forward what Dr. Talwar rightly mentioned, talking about my experience when I was visiting our US office. So one of our managers, he brought his kid to his office, and his kid mentioned that I need to have this ice cream, right? And that's when he mentioned, you don't need this ice cream, you want this ice cream. So then I actually rechecked my basics, and these two words are very different, the word need and the word want. So now at our office recently, we do language courses, and we get a lot of demand for Korean language courses. And when we talk to those kids, we get to know that they want to learn Korean language, they don't need Korean language, right? They want to learn Korean language because they want to watch those sitcoms, those Korean sitcoms well. And this want is actually making people doing new startups in the field of Korean language, right? Because that want-based desire is also something which should be focused on, because jobs, elections, jobs, skills, it's all need-based currently. But slowly the entire industry, the entire ecosystem, which now the current generation, they want to work in companies where they get quality of life, right? 3 generations earlier, it was more about need-based living, right? They have to, for survival. Then the industry shifted to standard of living. Now it's all about quality of life. And now for quality of life, you cannot just make the current youth have that driver in them for the need. They don't have any need. Their parents have sufficed that. They want quality of life, and for that, they want their desires to be fulfilled, their goals to be fulfilled, and that is something which also skills should be focusing at, right? So, industry, governments should also leave that air for people to learn what they want to learn and not just what they need to learn. So, yes, online can definitely measure that, and online has its own metrics. When you talk about attendance, right? Online industry did a transformative change in the attendance. Earlier, I remember at Delhi College of Engineering, half of my attendance was all just checked by my friends, right? But now I cannot do that because now it's QR code-based attendance, right? We cannot do that. So that's all thanks to how the online and the physical institutions, they merged with each other. Similarly, all these transformations are all thanks to the edtech industry, which is coming in. Yes, edtech industry cannot suffice alone. It needs the help from the universities. It needs help from the industry. But ultimately, edtech came to bridge that gap which the universities had with them, bridge that gap which the companies were having with them. And that's where online can measure a lot of metrics effectively. And if something online cannot, then EdTech has introduced this concept of hybrid now. And that's where we'll continue to survive.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Mr. Basani, coming to you now. Again, you have heard all your co-panelists speak. Are there any comments you would like to make and add on to the conversation? And also to ask you, because we are talking a lot about demands from students, how do you kind of get around that in your own institute?
To be very honest, we don't listen to students because I don't think they have the knack or ability to comprehend a lot of the things that he mentioned, needs and wants. So there's a bit of confusion there. So I think just apart from students, I'd like to just mention we are doing, not just us, I mean the state and the center is pushing skill development on a whole. So not just at the higher level skills, but mid-level, and a lot of the skill, the push is quite evident. And even in Karnataka, if you see, the ministry is ensuring and encouraging institutions and private entities to focus more on skills because they're looking, of course, I mean, they're not looking at the longer term aspects of things, but they're looking at the shorter term, something that is more in need of the hour, something that is less than 5 years. That has been something that we need to understand, and at an institutional level, I think what has been happening throughout has been most institutions, or if not all, have been focusing on 30 hours of this certification or 60 hours of this certification. That's great. I mean, you can keep doing that, but do not forget to ensure that the meta skills are also considered. When we talk about 21st century skills, we're talking about all these things like creativity and problem solving and all these things, but how do you do everything in such a short time? Because usually these things take time. And given the fact that students are with us for 2 years or 4 years or whatever, it's not the easiest of things to do, but it's something that's definitely possible in terms of introducing them to these aspects. And a small example I'd like to probably give is we introduced theater and management. We thought we have to do a bit of experimentation, so let's introduce theater and management. And the whole objective, the outcome that we were looking for was building confidence and to ensure that students were more clear in their thoughts. And communication was a huge aspect because of the students that we deal with. And we did run 2 batches, and we saw tremendous results with this small practice of theater. And who would have thought that, you know, the softer sciences or humanities could have an impact on management studies, right? And it's got its relevance, and going forward, I think multidisciplinary education being the theme, it's really about finding what fits rightly to you and what works the best for you. So I think, just finally, I think to touch upon what Dr. Talwar said was about the industry, academia, and the government, the triple helix model of what he was talking about. I think that's paramount because it's kind of like a 3-legged stool. We can't work with just 2 of them or 1 of them. And this doesn't mean that, you know, you come and ask for internships and have MOUs. It has to be much deeper, much beyond that. Till then, it's all just on paper. With the industry, they have to be more recipient to what we are trying to do and think long term. And what's happening currently, obviously, is everyone has their own L&D centers and they focus more on keeping things to themselves. I think that needs to open up. It helps the entire ecosystem on the whole, not just individual companies. So till that happens, massive change takes time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Darbar?
I think that's, everybody's got good points. One thing that EdTech potentially does very well is personalization. And I think a lot of standalone or higher education institutions, universities believe they do a lot of personalization. But the fact is that a lot many times, there's always a difference between the active and the slow learners, right? And many times in university setups or in setups wherein the cohorts are much, much larger, the slow learners don't necessarily benefit from closer interaction with faculty or with the mentoring or whatever else, unless and until a few people can possibly do that. But I think EdTech, I mean, this is where the dichotomy is. This is where, you know, the irony is. Obviously, it's about scale, but because of technology, they can also get into a lot of personalization. And some EdTech startups are actually doing that, I mean, to be honest, and that's their business model. But I think it has to be viewed beyond being a business model, right? So that's one. The other is obviously when you talked about measuring, I think the EdTech firms should also be able to do their own renditions of course outcomes, program educational objectives, right? You know, what is my student doing possibly 5-6 years down the line, right? Based on, you know, my vision, my mission, or whatever else. I think this can all be done. But obviously, it'll all happen now, in my opinion, because I think this is when a lot of consolidation is already taking place. This is where a lot of the EdTech firms are obviously reviewing the models. I'm saying the higher education institution, the traditional ones, are also doing exactly the same, right, at this moment of time. And I think, you know, for survival as well as for success, they all have to kind of review what they actually do with the student.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we have time for maybe one question from the audience, if anyone has any. Yes, gentleman in the back. Can someone pass him a mic?
I'm Professor Suri. I have been a founding director of Rajiv Gandhi Institute of Petroleum Technology and a founding vice chancellor of Manad University and founding project director for IIM Shillong. I've been into the government for many, many years. If we look at, I would like to have the perspective from the panelist that the perspective of the government and the perspective of the policy makers and implementers and the legislative framework has not been discussed in terms of transformation. We haven't made an inroad in terms of the spending in the education system, right from primary education to higher education, and education being a fundamental right. And health is not a fundamental right. Let me be very candid. How the well-being of the people who are the policy makers and the student and the parents who are going to be a major stakeholder, and how this equilibrium be taken into consideration, and how the advocacy of children, parents, and all stakeholders in terms of having a good education for well-being of them is being taken forward.
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about how do we also take into account the well-being and health of students in the education system?
The major thing is the policy framework and implementation of the same.
All right. Is there
The
anyone?
investment portfolios policy. So wherever the juice is there, the food is there, everybody will go. During the COVID time, everybody was concerned about their well-being. And that's how the health tech, ed tech, and fintech grew. And how these things are going to be more stringent policy-wise, perspective-wise. I remember IIPM was a very big shark at one time. It disappeared from the market. Similarly, many of the peoples in the domains of health tech, domains of fintech, domains of edtech are also following the similar models. How are we going to control in terms of the well-being of an individual? Thank you.
So I think my assumption is when you're talking about well-being, I guess you're talking about successful career outcomes, right? Of at least I'm looking at it that way. So you're absolutely right. I think whether we talk in terms of the NEP and its implementation, whether we talk in terms of certain regulations that need to be kind of brought in to ensure that promised outcomes are being met. I think a lot of these things will be fundamentally very, very important. So at this moment of time, you would notice that UGC, you would notice that AICT and many of these players in the regulatory system are at least making some inroads in trying to see whether a lot of players that are outside the purview of the higher education system are also kind of following certain norms, right? So whether it is about what proportion, when they are getting into, let's say, agreements with higher education establishments or universities, what level of arrangements are happening, who's teaching what, is it possibly admissions and marketing relationship, or is it much beyond about delivery? So I think it's only now that a lot of the regulatory system is taking a look at the edtech firms to see how they can possibly be brought into the purview. Because I think in the last 2.5 years, because of the fact that everything has been online, because of the fact that a lot of movement has happened towards edtech firms or whatever, I think edtech firms as well as the government or the regulatory system didn't have the time or possibly the pressure to be able to look at how these firms are playing a role within the entire system of educational outcomes as a whole. But I think it will start happening now. There is some levels of regulation that at least representation is taking place. I think a lot of the movement will take place in terms of the association, in terms of how you classify the certifications, how these edtech firms look at possibly their own investments into higher educational establishments or traditional structures, how they could possibly look at this whole idea of diplomas or degrees. A lot of that is being currently looked at the moment. I think so, in a sense, there is now a movement away from this being a completely, let's say, a wild, wild west into some levels of regulation. So you'll see a lot of the well-being possibly happening right now as we go forward. I think the bigger issue obviously here is that there has to be a recognition by all and sundry, two recognitions. One, that the private educational setups are contributing equally and at times as well as the government on the state structures. And at the same time, the fact that there needs to be an acknowledgement of the the right-minded edtech firms also contributing to access and certain levels of basic and complex education being delivered. So I think that level playing platform first needs to be acknowledged by all parties. And only then we are able to possibly go and decide how we should look at all of them. I think
Thank you.
that's
I would like to
my
add to it
understanding,
here.
and maybe we can have an offline chat about that.
Mr. Gupta, I would request you to have your quick comment because we actually
Sure.
gone over time.
What I believe is that with tech coming in, edtech, fintech, and everything is coming in, the concept of mental health, mental well-being is coming in very fast, right? Before any policy, any regulatory comes in, there'll be a new industry by the name of mental health, which will kind of solve this problem before any policy, any regulatory come into picture. So that's what I wanted to add to.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, and thank you, panelists. I hope your question was answered, sir, but you can always continue this conversation after our panel. We've reached the end of today's discussion. I would like to thank our panelists for this awesome discussion, and I know there's still a lot we need to kind of get into, that we just cracked the surface of this topic. But thank you so much for coming here today, and thank you, audience, for being here and engaging with us. Have a great future sessions. Thank you.